Okay, I think we're live now. So, hello everybody. Welcome to my small section of the LlewellynCon 2023. My name is Ben Stimpson. I am the author or forthcoming author of Ancestral Whispers, a guide to ancestral veneration practices. So I've seen a couple of familiar names in the chat, and hello, good morning, and good afternoon, wherever you happen to be. So in the next 20 minutes, what I'm going to be discussing is the intersection between ancestral veneration practices and ancestral work and our own identity. 20 minutes is such a short amount of time to really get into this. So really, this is just a 20-minute plug for my book. I go into greater detail into this in Ancestral Whispers, which is coming out in September, and I believe October for the UK and other parts of the world. So a little bit of background for who I am. So my name is Ben Stimpson. I've been part of the pagan community for about 20 years. I came in when I was a teenager, and I'm in my mid-30s right now. I live up in Ontario, Canada, but I'm originally from the United Kingdom, few years ago, and that part really is part and parcel of why I wrote this book. Why ancestor work has been such an important part of my life and my life story and my life journey is that moving from a different country to Canada and really leaving a lot of those ancestral connections in the old country. So over the next 20 minutes, we're going to discuss a few things. We're going to discuss kind of a little briefly what ancestor veneration actually is. We're going to discuss then its practical implications for you on your identity journeys. I'm a therapist up here. A lot of my work tends to be with clients around the idea of identity and identity exploration as a form of therapy and as a form of working on self. And what I love about ancestor work in particular as a form of spirituality is that when it comes to story, our story is interconnected with the story of our ancestors and their ancestors going back generations and generations. So we're going to discuss a little bit about what ancestor work is. We're then going to kind of move into what ancestor work as a spiritual practice, not so much as a witchcraft practice, can look like. And really, it's going to be a Cole's Notes of the book. So as I said, my story is that I'm originally from the United Kingdom. I'm from North Wales. And I came over to Canada when I was 8 years old. And that caused a great deal of issue for me as a kid who didn't have any control in coming over. It caused a great deal of trauma for me, and it caused a great deal of disconnection for me. And so for all of my life, home, that sense of homeland, that sense of home, that sense of belonging has always been an important part of my own life story. When I was a teenager, I came out as queer. I'm part of the LGBT community. So there are layers upon layers of that feeling of disconnection, that feeling of not belonging. And it was about 7 years ago that I really started to kind of deep dive into ancestor work as a spiritual practice. After many years of exploring ancestors as a form of history. Obviously, being an immigrant, the stories of the family are very, very important for maintaining that sense of familial identity, maintaining that sense of kind of cultural identity too. I was very interested and always interested in kind of hearing about my family, hearing about my grandparents, hearing about kind of the goings on of our extended family, particularly because I wasn't really connected with them over there. In my entire life, I've only been back to the UK once, and that was for an extended working holiday. And so for a long time, the UK for me, the sense of home, the sense of familial connection was more of a mental construct. It was more of a story as opposed to a lived experience. And so moving into kind of working with ancestors in a spiritual lens it created a lived experience for me, as opposed to just a set of stories that I could hear and explore and listen to, or photographs that I could look at, that there was always a disconnection with. So, oh, I see everybody in the chat saying good morning, and there's a wonderful, yeah, I hope we'll address about adoption. Yeah, we will talk about that too, don't worry. I came into working with a spiritual tradition called Lukumi. It's an Afro-Cuban tradition geared towards the Orishas, commonly also called Santeria. And one of the baseline foundational components of that spiritual practice is ancestor work. And it's ancestor work that is, again, not as a mental construct, but as a lived relationship. It's seeing the ancestors not, again, as these vague figures in the past, but as individuals that we can connect with here and now through a spiritual practice. And so when I started to explore ancestor work in that way, I started to see not only did my life start to change, but all of these stories, all of these connections, all of these pieces that I had lived with as a story in my life started to make a lot more sense on a practical level. It was around that same time that I was also doing my psychotherapy education and training. And I started to look at family story as not just, again, stories in the past, but as components of my life now. And I was doing a very particular form of family history work called a genogram, which looks at family issues, addictions, subpersonalities, really the context of my ancestors and how their context developed and was passed down through the generations, created the context for each successive generation, until eventually it came to me. So my life, our lives, I should say, really, I should bring everybody into this conversation. Our lives and the world that we live in now didn't come from nothing. It came from the context of our forebears, whether that be blood relatives, whether that be affinity ancestors, whether that be whoever came before us, contributed to the world that we live in now. And so when I started to see the two pieces together, and it was amazing that they happened to coincide with each other, I started to see that, yes, my family history and our family histories are all connected and create the world that we live in now. But those individuals who created those contexts are not just gone and off in the middle of nowhere and off in some vague afterlife. They are accessible, at least through the Lukumi spiritual lens. They are accessible here and now, to be contacted, to be related to build a relationship with. And so when I started to put those pieces together, I saw that things started to shift and a lot of things changed in my life. So let's talk a little bit then about kind of how I think ancestor work tends to be incorporated into the West, because I'm not so certain that I would have had the opportunity to relate to my ancestors in this way if I hadn't joined a Lukumi Ile, a spiritual house, if I hadn't started to see ancestry in that way, as opposed to just as an archetypal, vague family history sort of sense. I think we often tend to, at least in the witchcraft community, think about ancestral work as a way of witchcraft, as a way of gaining something, as a way, as a part, sometimes a small part of a much broader kind of spiritual approach. So much of paganism, so much of spiritual practice in the West, I would say, is geared towards deities, it's geared towards spirits, and then ancestors are brought in as not an afterthought. Well, it's very dismissive, but I do think that the emphasis on ancestors is not necessarily as strong as deity work or spirit work. And so when I started to think about kind of what was out there, Because one of the biggest things with doing ancestor work through a spiritual tradition whose culture is not a culture I come from, the rituals were beautiful. They worked within that system. They work, I should say, within that system. But many of the ancestors that we were working with were the ancestors of that spiritual tradition. And then my ancestors happened to be there just because I was there. So I was starting to explore and think for myself, what could an approach working with ancestors as a spiritual practice outside of witchcraft, right? Outside of necessarily using the ancestors or working with the ancestors for some sort of a goal, what could that look like? What could an authentic relationship with my ancestors, and I'm talking about blood ancestors here, but we will talk about other forms of ancestors soon too, because I did see some questions in there. What could that look like for me? What could the rituals and the symbols and that approach look like for me that would be meaningful and that would build off of the relationship I already had with some of my ancestors, but also that would be culturally relevant to us all, right? And so then I started to sit down and I started to think about, okay, deep diving, looking at my culture, looking at the history, looking at then the shared history of us all. And I came to realize several major things. One, that ancestors are both unique and ultimately connecting us all. When you look at what ancestors are and kind of how ancestors evolve, I think we often tend to think about the ones that are directly related to us. But when you go back further generations, you start to see that the ancestral tree gets big and huge and wide until eventually everybody here, everybody in our chat today is somehow related to each other. There's one ancestor that connects all of us. You just have to go back far enough, right? And so the individual family stories become the story of the community, the story of the region, and the story of the whole of humanity. There's also another component there where the further back you go, the more a single ancestor will start to show up multiple times in your family tree. And this is called genealogical breakdown. I saw a couple of comments here earlier on that we have some genealogists in the chat. So you will all know what this means. It basically means that the further back you go, the less humans there actually were, right? And so it's not feasible to understand ancestry is so linear. You know, if you have two grandparents, four great grandparents, 8 great grandparents, and so on and so on, by the time you get back, say 200 or 300 years, you're looking at millions of ancestors. And it's not feasible for that to necessarily happen. So how that's explained and theorized is that single ancestor starts to show up multiple times in a family tree. And so then when you start to think of it in that way, then the family tree becomes more like a family web. And that's what I found really empowering for thinking about then, how can I develop traditions and work with my ancestors in a way that's going to be culturally competent for me and culturally sensitive and also relevant to me. And then I started to think, okay, well, this is where I start to understand my ancestors less as individual family lineages and more about communities. If I go back, you know, a few centuries, the chances are that the majority of the people living in a specific area are my ancestors. So I saw a comment earlier about that people would hope that I would talk about adoption. So in the book, I do go through that idea of adoption. How do you relate to ancestors through adoption? I actually have an ancestor 2 generations back who was adopted. We don't have her blood lineage, but we have her adopted blood lineage. And so I talk about that in the book about, you know, how do you conceptualize that for you? How do you relate to that? How do you relate to these individuals? And for me, what I've come to understand is that, again, it comes back to that idea of the further back you go, everybody in the community, everybody in the region will be related to you in some way. So your family story becomes less about you and more about the group. Okay, so I feel like I'm kind of really going at it with this. There's a lot more explanation of those pieces in the book. But I do want you to keep that in mind when it comes to ancestor work, that eventually what happens is ancestor work becomes less about you and your needs, and then more about the community and the communal needs. Ancestor work becomes less of an individual spirituality, and it starts to become a communal spirituality, right? So how then does your story and ancestral story collide? Where does that word identity come in? So as a therapist, I see often that clients are caught in stories that they've told themselves. And in many ways, when we think about it, culture, shared culture, is a story that we all tell ourselves. It is the responsibilities, it's the roles, it's the rules that we live by in a society. But all of these rules developed from other rules and other societies that existed before us. Society in itself has ancestors going back into generations. So then if we see ourselves as individual components in a much broader whole, in a collective of identities, then there's both opportunities and there's dangers in that, right? There's an idea that we might have to somehow always bend to the will of the culture, which is ancestral to us all. But there's also that piece about then understanding, okay, where do I begin and society ends? Where does society begin and I end? What are some of these maladaptive beliefs and rules and roles that we just take up because we somehow feel like we have to, or that we've been told in a family setting that it's necessary for us to fit in? And so then ancestor work can actually help us in many ways figure those things out for ourselves in relationship with our ancestors. I'll give you a very, very good example. So I come from a family of entrepreneurs. Both my parents are were business owners. They just retired, and they for many years dealt with workaholism, right? They were so connected to their business that it was impossible for them to not think that way. And when I was doing my family history research, and also when I was doing my ancestral work, I started to dive into that question more. Why are my parents like this? And first of all, why are they together if that's one of their issues? And I noticed that as I went back through the family tree, spooky similarities started to appear on both sides of the family tree. There were two main ancestors on my mum and dad's side who were living around the same time. They were living in adjacent cities, and they were both involved during World War I in black marketeering. They were both involved in being self-made people. That was a very important cultural understanding for themselves and identity for themselves. And so they really impressed upon their children that being a self-made person was huge, that was most important than anything else. And so then that story came down the generations and came to then my parents, who grew up in families where being self-made and being self-employed was very, very important, especially in the context of Northern England and the culture of Northern England. And so then they saw in each other that same similar sort of cultural kind of understanding, and then they came together. And then that was impressed down onto me as a kid, right? Work hard. You need to work hard. Don't be working for other people, because that's taking away your freedom, and so on and so on. So if I really look back further than that, I looked back 2 generations, 3 generations previous. And the kind of the seed of those 2 ancestors, their great grandparents, were both involved in something called the workhouse, which was basically a debtor's prison, right? They were made to feel like they were nothing, that they were morally corrupt, inferior, all of these things, because of how society was, how sharp society was. And so the seeds of my life started actually almost 180 years ago. In understanding that, then I was able to let go of some of my anger of how my parents, treated us when it came to the business, because of the workaholism that they were dealing with. Right, the business always came first, and family needed to be understanding of that. Right, I was able to let go of my feelings of that, and it was interesting because then when bringing in the relationship with ancestors came in, I had a very powerful experience during a dumb supper. And I speak about that in the book too. A dumb supper is a ritual of sitting with the dead, communing with the dead. You often see this around Samhain and Halloween. And it's really a very powerful experience. And I actually had my grandfather come and sit in the chair and speak to me. And I asked him, why were you so hard on my dad? Because some of the stories in the family were that he was very hard on my dad. And he said, I need you to understand I didn't know what I know now. That my father, I thought I was doing your father a service by being hard on him, by trying to make him the best person he could be. And I didn't realize what I was doing with that. And we had a conversation around that, and it was so powerful to hear that. That was that bridging, like I said, the bridging between the family stories and the understanding of the history with then the actual reality of the individual in front of me. So if you take anything away from this today, there is a difference between family history work and ancestor veneration. Ancestor veneration is bringing the ancestors out of the past so that you can relate to them and have a relationship with them in the here and now, and gain understanding of who you are, putting yourself in a much broader context, but also putting those ancestors into their own contexts as well. I see we have quite a lot of questions in here. I really appreciate everybody coming here. Let me see here. Some beautiful conversations. I hope I get a chance to actually read these later on. So the book, very, very briefly, what the book actually is. So Ancestral Whispers is a guide to developing ancestor veneration practices as a lived spirituality. I touch a little bit on genealogy in this and genealogical research, but what I'm actually doing with this is it's a bit like a therapy session. I'm getting you to ask yourself the really important questions. I don't give you rituals to do in this book, but I empower you to develop your own rituals in an authentic and intimate way. I don't give you a list of correspondences or a list of beliefs to think about ancestors with. What I'm asking you is to consider for yourself, what do you actually believe the ancestors are? Who do you consider ancestors? I talk a great deal about different forms of ancestor in here. So I talk about adopted relatives. I talk about affinity ancestors. I talk about conceptual ancestors. And if you go to my website, www.benstimpson.com, there are an abundance of other materials and resources on my website, other interviews that I've done where I go into talking about those concepts more specifically. Fortunately, 23 minutes is such a small amount of time to go into that. I also share a great deal more on my Facebook page, Ben Stimpson Author at Facebook, and I'll put that into the chat. If you'd like to follow me on there, I'm going to be expressing more around that and those concepts. I also, so the first part of the book is about kind of the thinky bits. How do you conceptualize ancestors? And I'm asking you a lot of questions. I am asking you questions on almost every page so that you can really journal through and really explore these concepts for yourself. And then in part 2, I take you through each of the various elements of a ritual lived practice. because I think a lot of people come to these to these spiritualities not knowing what to do, because oftentimes doing is actually as more powerful than the thinking of it. So I take you through everything from the ritual practice, um, uh, giving meaningful objects. I talk about pilgrimage. I talk about physical representation, how to use pictures or objects connected to your ancestors in your work. And I also talk about then conceptualizing lived practice. What is an actual lived ancestral spiritual practice, and what could it be? I also give a load of resources at the back here. And I'll be honest with you, I wrote this almost 2.5 years ago, and I've been through the editing process, but every time I open the book, there's something that I've forgotten that I put in there. So I'm as excited to see the final copy when that comes out. Okay, let me see here. Okay, so I'm going to stop, and we've got 5 minutes or 4 minutes left for some questions. So if you have some burning questions, put them into the chat, and I will select some as they come up, and we can talk a little bit more about that. If you have other questions, feel free to reach out to me on Facebook, my website, and we can explore more of that. I might explore those in general posts, or I might speak specifically. So, oh, thank you, Nathan. It's good to see you there. That's good start to me. What are your thoughts on that? Okay, what remind me, Llewellyn, who is what was the question? Oh. Okay, so in starting then, there are other ancestral veneration books out there. If you wanted to start with some of those, absolutely. What I would say is start by actually looking at who your ancestors are, right? Start by starting with you and bridging outwards. Who do you consider to be an ancestor? And that can be anyone. The real question is, how do you conceptualize who an ancestor is? Is an ancestor actually only a blood relative? Is an ancestor, you know, those aunties and those uncles that in our cultures we often bring into our families who are not related to us? Are they the people who are lineaged to you through your profession or through whatever your work is? You know, for me, one of my ancestors is William Shakespeare, because I'm a writer, and I connect to him mainly because he's such a big part of my culture, right? So start with that. Start to think about, how do you even conceptualize that? Okay. Let's see here. Quick question. Do you believe we have non-human ancestral spirits that we can work with? Absolutely, I do, El. Yes, absolutely, I do. And I do talk about that in the book here. Again, it comes down to, how do you conceptualize ancestors? You know, if there are many examples around the world of families and communities that have mythological or legendary ancestors. What is the relationship? And that's really, I should have started with that word before. Relationship is huge when it comes to this work. What is your relationship to those ancestors, those conceptual ancestors, to those spiritual ancestors? And how does that relationship show up in your life? Is it a healthy relationship? Is it an unhealthy relationship? So, and I talk a great deal about that in the book as well. So let's see here. Always referred to intelligence as my fellow brethren. Exactly, Jamie. Yes. So that also comes back to the question of family. And I talk, as a queer person, I have chosen family. And I think most marginalized communities have this idea of chosen family as well. How do you then honor your chosen family and the ancestors of those chosen families? A lot of queer people during Pride are honoring our queer ancestors right now. And they aren't related to us by blood, but they're related to us. We know them because we live a similar lifestyle to them or have experienced similar things to them. Yes. Yes, in the spirit of home, El, absolutely. Yes, and I talk about, so a lot of my own take in this is animistic, but I do ask, during the earlier part, I do ask about like, what do you believe? How do you bring in cultural understandings of the dead and so forth? So unfortunately, our time has run out. Thank you so much for everybody who came. I did see a couple of podcast invites in the chat. If you're interested in having me on for your podcast, please reach out to me through my website, benstimpson.com, or through my Facebook page, Ben Stimpson Author. It has been an absolute joy to spend time with you over the last half an hour. Please go and find the book. It comes out September 8th in the United States, and I think several weeks after that in Canada, and a month after that in the UK and Europe. Thank you, everybody. And please do join Christopher Hughes, who is right after me in half an hour, who is going to talk to us all about Druidry. And he has his own book coming out. I think it has come out. And he's always a joy. Thank you, everybody. And thank you so much for joining the LlewellynCon 2023. Have a good day. Bye-bye.